The zipper on my suitcase shrieked in the quiet apartment, a sound I had been dreaming of for 4 months. It was 11:30 p.m. on a Friday. My flight to Miami leaves in 7 hours. Finally, after 4 years of 70-hour weeks, missed holidays, and swallowed pride, I was leaving. Then, the front door crashed open. I jumped, my heart hammering against my ribs, as Gavin and Deborah, my parents and my bosses, marched into my living room without knocking. They had used their spare key. Again, Deborah tossed a thick manila folder onto my perfectly packed suitcase. It slid off and hit the floor with a heavy, melodious thud. "Vacation's off," she announced, not even looking me in the eye. The Vertex account moved their closing date up. "We need you on site tomorrow at 7 a.m. for the final staging walkthrough. The contracts get signed Monday morning. If the property isn't perfect, the deal dies." "No," I said, my voice shaking. "I booked this months ago. You approved it." Gavin stepped forward, his face twisting into that familiar, terrifying sneer. "Don't be selfish, Kara. The business comes first. If you walk out on this family now, don't bother coming back. And we'll make sure Neos Architecture firm never sees a dime of Luxstage's contract money again." My stomach dropped. They weren't just threatening my job. They were holding my fiancé's livelihood hostage. I looked at my parents, seeing the cruelty in their eyes. "Fine," I whispered, forcing my hands to unclench. "I'll stay." My name is Kara Hayden. I'm 26 years old, the operations director for the city's top staging firm, and I had just realized that my parents didn't love me. They only loved what I could earn for them. To understand why I didn't scream at them right then and there, you have to understand the trap I was in. On paper, Luxstage was a family empire. In reality, it was a house of cards that I was holding up with my bare hands. Gavin spent his days playing golf and networking at the country club. Deborah spent hers at 3-hour luncheons. I did the logistics, the design, the client management, and the crisis control. I worked 80 hours a week for a salary that was 30% less than what our interns made at other firms. "It's equity, Kara," they would say whenever I asked for a raise. "One day, this will all be yours." I remembered a specific night 2 years ago. I was in the hospital, hooked up to an intravenous for severe dehydration and exhaustion. My phone rang. It was Deborah. She didn't ask how I was. She asked where the swatches for the penthouse listing were. "We're at dinner with the clients," she had chirped, the sound of clinking wine glasses in the background. "We need to close this tonight. Talk them through the color palette over the phone, sweetie." I did it. I closed $1 million deal from a hospital bed while my parents ate steak on the company card. That was the dynamic. I was the golden goose, and they were the farmers who would happily work me to death as long as the eggs kept coming. The breaking point didn't come at work, though. It came at home. For months ago, Neo proposed. He was everything my parents weren't. Kind, patient, and genuinely supportive. He got down on one knee in our tiny kitchen, and for the first time in years I felt like I could breathe. When I told my parents the next day, expecting a hug or at least a congratulations, the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. "A wedding takes a lot of time to plan, Kara," Deborah said, frowning at the modest diamond on my finger. "Who is going to handle the fall rollout if you're distracted by flower arrangements?" They didn't see my marriage as a happy milestone. They saw it as a threat to their convenience. If I had a husband, I might have a life. And if I had a life, I couldn't be their on-call servant. From that day on, the sabotage began. They overloaded my schedule with pointless meetings whenever I had a wedding venue tour. They critiqued Neo, constantly calling him unambitious because he refused to work weekends. I booked the cruise in secret, using my personal laptop at a coffee shop, so they wouldn't see the confirmation on the company network. It was a desperate act of self-preservation. I needed to remember who I was without them. But evidently, even that was too much freedom for them to allow. 2 days before the trip, my company-issued phone started acting strange. The battery was draining in hours, and the screen would light up when no one was touching it. I took it to a friend of mine who worked in cybersecurity, thinking it was just a glitch. He plugged it into his laptop, and his face went pale. "Kara," he said quietly, "who gave you this phone?" "My parents. It's on the company plan." He turned the screen toward me. "This isn't a glitch. It's asset lock. It's enterprise-level spyware. It's not just tracking your GPS location. It's logging every keystroke, reading every text, and it can remotely activate the microphone to listen to your conversations." I felt the blood drain from my face. The random calls when I was out with Neo, the way they always knew exactly where I was, down to the specific store aisle. It wasn't parental concern. It was surveillance. Because I had booked the cruise off-network, they knew I was taking time off, but they didn't know where. This app was their insurance policy to make sure I never slipped off the leash again. That was the moment the sadness evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, hard rage that settled deep in my bones. They wanted to track me? Fine. I would give them something to track. Back in my apartment, the door clicked shut behind Gavin and Deborah. They left satisfied, convinced they had once again bullied me into submission. They thought I was unpacking. I wasn't. I sat down at my personal laptop, the one they didn't know about, and opened a new document. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I began to type. For the next 4 hours, I wrote the handover Bible. It was a 40-page document detailing every password, every vendor contact, every client quirk, and every intricate logistical maneuver required to keep Lux Stage running for a single day. I uploaded it to the secure company server, password protected, and set a timer. The file would become visible in 48 hours, Monday morning. Then I drafted my resignation email to Gavin Hayden, Deborah Hayden, and the board. Effective immediately, I am resigning from my position as operations director. I scheduled the email to send at the exact same time the file would unlock. I wasn't just leaving for a vacation. I was leaving forever. But for my plan to work, I needed to buy myself a head start. I needed them to think I was still under their thumb, right up until the moment the trap snapped shut. I stood in the 24-hour FedEx Center, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. My hands were trembling, but not from fear anymore, from adrenaline. In my bag was the company iPhone 15 Pro, fully charged. To ensure it stayed alive for the journey, I plugged it into a heavy-duty 20,000 milliamp hours power bank, taping the two devices together into a solid brick. I wrapped the bundle in 3 layers of thick bubble wrap, treating it like the toxic waste it was. I grabbed a shipping box and sealed the device inside. With a black marker, I wrote the destination in bold block letters. Storm Point in San Juan Islands. Underneath, I added a note for the front desk. Please hold for guest arrival, K. Hayden. I had already printed a Saturday priority delivery label online to ensure it would hit the island by the afternoon. I slapped the label on the box and dropped it into the overnight bin. It landed with a heavy thud. The digital leash was cut. I walked out into the cool night air and stopped at a convenience store to buy a cheap burner phone with cash. As I slotted the SIM card in, I felt a strange lightness in my chest. By 5:30 a.m., I was navigating the chaos of Miami International Airport. My heart lurched every time I saw a security guard or heard a PA announcement, half expecting to hear my name called out or to see Gavin storming through the sliding doors. I kept my head down, pulling my cap lower, clutching my boarding pass like a lifeline. As I walked down the jet bridge, the humid Florida air hit me, thick with the promise of freedom. I found my seat and stared out the window at the tarmac. I imagined my parents back at the office, probably sitting in my chair, waiting for me to show up and fix whatever mess they had created. They had no idea that the me they were tracking was currently sitting in a FedEx cargo plane rumbling toward the other side of the country. Just before the flight attendant asked us to switch to airplane mode, I powered on the cheap burner phone. I sent a single text to Neo, who was holding down the fort back home. The Eagle has flown. The decoy is in transit. I love you. I turned the phone off, leaned back, and let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding since I was 22. The plane accelerated, and for the first time I wasn't looking back. I wasn't there to see the explosion at 9 a.m. Saturday morning, but Jessica, our terrified receptionist, recounted the scene to me later with gleeful precision. Gavin and Deborah arrived at the Lux Stage offices, ready for war. When they saw my empty desk, Gavin didn't call me. He opened the Asset Lock app. He expected to see my dad at home sulking. Instead, the screen updated with a new, static location. It wasn't in the city. It had just pinged at a major distribution hub in Seattle, Washington. They were baffled. Since they didn't know about the cruise booking, they assumed I had snapped and run off to that rustic spa retreat in the San Juan Islands I had mentioned years ago as a dream trip. She thinks she can hide on an island. Gavin reportedly screamed, throwing his tablet onto the conference table. She's mocking us. The Vertex walkthrough, the crucial prep meeting for Monday's signing, was forgotten instantly. Their need for control outweighed their business sense. They canceled on the clients, blaming a family medical emergency, and sprinted out of the building. It's a 5-hour flight, Gavin told Deborah as they ran. We'll charter a jet, fly out, drag her back by her hair, and have her on site for the signing Monday morning. By the time I was sipping a welcome cocktail on the cruise deck, my parents were standing on a windy tarmac 3,000 miles away near Seattle. It was early afternoon local time. The ferry schedule was too slow for Gavin's rage, so he flashed his platinum credit card and chartered a private seaplane to bridge the final gap before the weather turned. The pilot, a seasoned local named Mac, looked at the sky with concern. Mr. Hayden, the barometer is dropping fast. There's a system moving in. We might be able to beat it, but it's going to be tight. Then stop talking and fly, Gavin barked, dragging Deborah toward the small Cessna. I'm paying you for speed, not commentary. We have to be back in the city tomorrow. They took off into the gray, churning sky, confident in their money and their power. They believed they were the predators chasing a runaway child. They had no idea they were flying directly into the mouth of a storm that was accelerating faster than any forecast predicted. They weren't hunting, they were being herded. The seaplane bucked and weaved through the gale, slamming onto the choppy water near the storm point and dock just as the first sheets of rain began to fall. It was nearly dark. Soaked and furious, Gavin and Deborah stormed into the small, wood-paneled lobby. There were no other guests, just the howling wind outside and a confused teenager manning the desk. Kara Hayden! Deborah shrieked, water dripping from her designer coat. We know she's here. Her phone is right here. She waved her tracker, the dot pulsing directly over the building thanks to the battery pack, keeping it alive. The receptionist blinked, checking the log. We don't have a guest by that name. Oh, wait. A package arrived via Saturday priority this afternoon. He reached under the counter and produced the heavy FedEx box. Gavin snatched it, his brows furrowing slightly at the weight. It felt too heavy to be just a phone, but his rage overrode his logic. He tore through the tape and the bubble wrap. He pulled out the iPhone brick, still taped to the massive battery bank. It was fully charged, and at that exact moment, the alarm I had set went off. The screen lit up with a bright, cheerful notification. Enjoy the vacation. The color drained from Gavin's face. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the cheerful marimba ringtone echoing against the wooden walls. The trap had snapped shut. Gavin barely had time to smash the phone against the wall before the lobby's overhead fixtures flickered and died. The storm Mac had tried to beat wasn't just coming. It had arrived with the force of a freight train. Outside, the wind screamed like a banshee, shaking the timber frames of the inn. Mac stumbled back into the lobby, his jacket soaked through. That's it, he yelled over the thunder. Coast Guard just issued a harsh weather warning. No flights, no ferries. We missed the window. We're grounded until this cell passes. You don't understand. Deborah shrieked, clutching her pearls as if they could protect her from the cold draft sweeping through the room. We have a business to run. We need to be back by Monday. We need Wi-Fi. The receptionist, a kid who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, just shrugged. Lines are down, ma'am. Usually happens when the wind hits 60. No internet, no cell service. Unless you have a satellite phone. They didn't. They had my iPhone. Gavin looked down at the device in his hand. It was a $1,200 paperweight. It had my apps, my photos, and my alarm, but out here in the teeth of a Pacific storm it had 0 bars. For the first time in his life, Gavin Hayden couldn't yell his way out of a problem. They were trapped in a rustic nightmare with no way to call for help, no way to check emails, and, crucially, no way to leave. 3,000 miles away, the only water hitting me was the condensation on my glass of iced tea. I was sitting on the private balcony of my cabin, watching the Caribbean Ocean stretch out like a sheet of turquoise silk. The sun was warm on my face, a sensation so foreign it felt almost illicit. I picked up my burner phone and checked the weather app one had set for Storm Point, WA. The screen was awash of red warnings and severe gale icons. I took a sip of my drink, the ice clinking softly. I pictured my parents in that drafty lobby, likely screaming at a poor service worker who couldn't fix the sky. For 4 years, my life had been governed by the terrifying buzz of my phone. Every vibration was a crisis. Every ringtone was a demand. Now, there was just the sound of waves and the distant laughter of people having fun. Neo texted, "You okay?" I typed back, "I'm better than okay. I'm free." That night, I did something I hadn't done since college. I turned off the lights, crawled into the plush hotel bed, and didn't set an alarm. I closed my eyes, and for the first time, the silence wasn't heavy, it was peaceful. While I slept, the empire began to crumble. At 8:55 a.m. on Monday, the executive team from Vertex Global arrived at the Lux Stage headquarters. These were serious people, suits, briefcases, and a contract worth millions. They expected a final walkthrough of the strategy I had spent weeks building, followed by immediate signatures. Instead, they found a locked door inside the suite. Jessica, the receptionist, had let them into the waiting area, but she didn't have the keys to the executive conference room. Those were on Gavin's keychain. The files for the presentation, they were on the secure server, accessible only by biometric login, Gavin's or mine. The Vertex CEO, a man with zero patience for incompetence, checked his watch. "This is unacceptable," he muttered. He pulled out his phone and called Gavin. "The subscriber you are calling is not available." He frowned and turned to the reception desk. Jessica was standing there, flustered and near tears. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Ross. Mr. and Mrs. Hayden had a family emergency." "And where is Ms. Hayden?" he asked. "She's the one who knows the project." He dialed my work number. On a rain-battered island, inside a wet FedEx box, sitting on a reception desk, my phone rang and rang and rang. No one answered. The silence spoke louder than any apology could. The Vertex team waited 10 minutes, then walked out. At 9 a.m. sharp, the digital bomb detonated. My pre-scheduled email hit the inboxes of every employee, board member, and major client we had. Subject: Resignation and liability notice, Kara Hayden. It was professional, cold, and devastating. I didn't rant. I simply stated facts. I outlined the hostile work environment, the illegal surveillance, and the immediate termination of my employment. I attached the invoice for my unpaid performance commissions and unreimbursed vendor expenses, a figure that made the accountant gasp when she opened it. But the real kicker was the handover Bible. In the email I wrote, "Attached is a password-protected file containing all operational protocols. The password is Find Kara." The IT guy tried to open it. He typed it in. The file opened, but it was a labyrinth. I hadn't corrupted it. I had just written it in the shorthand code I used for myself. A complex system of abbreviations and cross-references that only I understood. To them, it looked like gibberish. "What does stage 4 protocol blue mean?" The junior designer panicked, staring at the screen. "And where are the vendor contacts?" It says here to reference Index B, the accountant said, clicking a link. But Index B just leads to a folder called Ask Kara. Panic set in. Without me there to translate the chaos, the business wasn't a well-oiled machine. It was a car crash in slow motion. By day 3, the storm point and had lost power. The generator was reserved for the kitchen and emergency lights, leaving the guest rooms in cold, gray shadows. Gavin and Deborah sat in the lobby, wrapped in scratchy wool blankets, eating lukewarm, canned soup provided by the staff. The facade of their partnership had cracked wide open. "This is your fault," Deborah hissed, shivering. "You had to charter the plane. You had to chase her. We could be at home right now handling Vertex." "My fault." Gavin slammed a spoon down. "You're the one who drove her away. Who's going to handle the rollout? You couldn't just let her get married." "I was protecting the business." "Well, look around, Deborah. There is no business." They were interrupted by the receptionist, who signaled them over to the emergency landline behind the desk. "The landline is working again," he muttered. Gavin scrambled to the phone and dialed his voicemail access code. He put it on speaker so Deborah could hear. "This is Vertex Global. We are pulling the contract. We will be suing for breach of agreement. This is the landlord. Your grace period on the rent arrears has expired. You are locked out effective immediately. This is Neo. Don't ever come near Kara again." Message after message played, a chorus of destruction. They stood there, holding the receiver like a lifeline, listening to their world and one beep at a time. The silence of the island was replaced by the roar of the returning seaplane. But the flight back wasn't the victory lap Gavin had imagined. It was a medevac for their egos. 7 days. They had been stuck for 7 days wearing the same clothes, eating canned beans, and stewing in their own failure. When they landed, they didn't go home to shower. They went straight to the office. They expected chaos. Papers everywhere, phones ringing. They expected to swoop in and save the day. Instead, they found a tomb. The lights were off. The blinds were drawn. A bright orange sticker was plastered across the glass doors. Notice of eviction. The landlord, a man Gavin had insulted regularly for years, had finally had enough. For months, I had been the one smoothing things over, negotiating extensions on the rent they constantly paid late to fund their country club dues. Without me there to charm him, the hammer had dropped. Deborah rattled the handle, frantic. "My purse is in there. My files." Gavin just stared at the notice, his face a mask of confusion. For the first time, he realized that his company had never really been his at all. It was a machine I had built, and he had just broken the only key. I let them stew in that reality for another week while I finished my vacation. When I finally returned, glowing and refreshed, I agreed to meet them. I picked a crowded diner downtown, neutral ground with witnesses. I walked in wearing a white linen suit, looking like I had just stepped off a yacht. They looked like ghosts. Gavin didn't even say hello. "You sabotaged us," he hissed, his hand shaking around a coffee mug. "We are going to sue you for every penny you have. You ruined the Vertex deal." I laughed, a genuine, bubbling sound that made Deborah flinch. "Stop it," I said. "I know about Project Exit." They froze. The color drained from their faces faster than it had on the island. "The emergency wasn't a client deadline," I continued, leaning in. "You were selling the company. $10 million. But the buyers had one condition. Me. They needed me to sign a 3-year employment contract to ensure the transition. That's why you needed me back Monday. You weren't trying to save a project. You were trying to lock me into a cage so you could cash out and retire to Florida." I watched the realization hit them. I knew. I had known all along. The crisis that justified canceling my vacation was actually a scheme to sell my future to the highest bidder. Gavin's face turned an ugly shade of gray. "We were doing it for the family," he stammered, his voice weak. "We would have given you a cut. We were securing your legacy." "A cut?" I raised an eyebrow. You were going to sell my hard work and leave me answering to new bosses while you played golf. That's not a legacy. That's a liquidation sale. I reached into my bag and pulled out a sleek black folder. I slid it across the sticky table. You see, when you didn't show up for the signing because you were busy chasing a FedEx box, the buyers got suspicious. They called me directly. Gavin opened the folder. It was an offer letter. Not for Luckstage, but for me. They realized that without me, Luckstage is just a name on a lease. I explained. They pulled your offer and offered to seed fund my new agency instead. I took the clients, Gavin. All of them. Vertex isn't suing. They're my first account. He stared at the document, his hands trembling. The checkmate was absolute. They had tried to sell me, and in doing so, they had sold themselves out. The air left the table. The fight went out of them instantly. It was pathetic to watch. The arrogance that had defined my entire life crumbled into desperation. Deborah reached across the table, her eyes wet with tears that might have even been real. Kara, please, she begged, her voice trembling. We're your parents. You can't do this. We'll lose the house. We'll lose everything. Just bring the clients back. We can work together. We'll make you a partner. A real partner this time. I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized I felt nothing. No anger. No fear. Just pity. They were small people who had cast a large shadow over my life for too long. I stood up and placed my burner phone on the table. It was a symbolic gesture, leaving the old lines of communication behind. I already have a partner, I said, thinking of Neo. And family doesn't put trackers on people they love. Family doesn't try to sell their children to secure a retirement fund. I turned away, the diner noise washing over me. I'm done, I said over my shoulder. And as I walked toward the door, I didn't hear parents calling for their daughter. I heard strangers mourning their bank account. 6 months later, the morning sun hit the floor-to-ceiling windows of Hayden and Associates, my agency. The office was buzzing with energy, but it was a different kind of energy. There was laughter. There was music. My team was working hard, but they were happy because they knew they would go home at 5 p.m. I sat at my desk, reviewing the final proofs for the Vertex campaign. It was flawless. Neo walked in, placing coffee on my desk and kissing my forehead. We were getting married next week, and for the first time, I was excited about the planning. My phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. I knew who it was. I had heard through the grapevine that the bank had foreclosed on my parents' house last week. They were likely calling to guilt-trip me, to yell, or to beg for a loan. I looked at the screen for a second, my thumb hovering over the decline button. I didn't feel a spike of adrenaline. I didn't feel the old panic. I just smiled, pressed the red button, and went back to work. Justice wasn't a storm. It was the quiet peace of finally being in control. I had won, not by fighting their war, but by building my own peace.